Flying just one jump away from the Free Worlds League space with the Terran hegemony's terraforming province, the world of New Dallas was a textbook example of planetary engineering. Swathed in a thick atmosphere made sweltering by an abundance of greenhouse gases, New Dallas was only marginally habitable at the time the first human settlements were established there in the mid 2300s. Within a century, hegemony sponsored terraforming efforts transformed the planet from a hellish hothouse into a subtropical paradise, ideal for agricultural development. As the original underground settlements gave way to mega farms and ranches fed by abundant water and blessed with long growing seasons and nutrient-rich soils, New Dallas became a breadbasket world during the Star League era, its produce capable of serving the needs of a dozen nearby systems. Its settlers were largely descended from Terran's North America continent and took great pride in their world, reviving much of the rugged individualism they carried there from their, quote, cowboy ancestry, as well as their close relationship to the Terran government. In time, the importance of New Dallas, combined with its cultural pride and deeply ingrained belief in self-reliance, led locals to raise one of the largest, best-equipped planetary militias in hegemony space. The Star League further bolstered this respectable defense force with 3 castles, Bryans, a dozen SLDF bases, training facilities, a naval base, and an SDS network. All this protection made subverting the world difficult for Stefan Amaris's forces and ultimately forced them to use widespread orbital bombardment to pummel the planet into submission, in the process destroying much of the carefully maintained environment management equipment. Even after the RimWorld's bombardment, a local resistance managed to harass the usurpers' troops through much of their occupation, drawing in ample supplies from the SLDF facilities missed by earlier attacks. While never successful in throwing off their eventual retreat, the RimWorld's forces resorted to a scorched earth tactics, including the complete destruction of the major city port of Vera. This act further crippled the planetary infrastructure, and its recovery remained far from complete when the Star League later dissolved. Then came House Merrick's invasion of March of 2787. Despite the collapse of the Star League, the people of New Dallas still considered themselves loyal citizens of the Terran hegemony, and they vowed never to relinquish their world to any of the treacherous houses that turned on her. In the process of their own efforts to rebuild, the local militia uncovered a nearly forgotten subterranean storehouse of royal quality battle mechs, vehicles, and other heavy equipment. These weapons, feared lost during the Amaris coup, now turned against the invaders from the Free Worlds League, and most were piloted by retired SLDF warriors who refused to join Kerensky's exodus. Expecting an easy time of their invasion after securing many of the surrounding hegemony systems, the Merrick forces were completely unprepared for the level of resistance put up by the New Dallas militia. After the 7th Merrick militia was all but destroyed by militia forces throughout the planet's Lake Galvez region, the 3rd Etrian Dragoons experienced fierce resistance outside of Cato City. The invasion commanders authorized the use of nuclear weapons to wipe out the resistors. The Merrick nuclear assault not only wiped out virtually all the New Dallas militia, but also laid waste to most of the planet's remaining major population centers. But few survivors remained afterwards to witness the ravaging of their planet's remaining resources by the League's corporate and military scavengers, as well as their world quickly regressed toward its original hellish state. Between the Amaris and Merrick conquest, the loss of so much support, New Dallas has been left to die, its population dwindling as its environment slides inexorably towards complete ruin. Stefan Latt, Forgotten Battles of the Succession War, Volume 2 by Green Bray Press, 2825. So, we're talking about ghost worlds of the inner sphere and beyond. One of the things that opened up so many worlds, so many marginal worlds in the inner sphere to exploitation, colonization, and more importantly, sustainable planetary growth and population is the ability to terraform the planets. Among all the Star League era technology that was at the top of the cutting edge, terraforming was right up there. The fact that they were able to terraform Mars and even Venus in the Sol system gives testament to just how much technology and capability, experience, and understanding was available. Among the many crowning achievements of humanity progression under the Star League was this thing called terraforming. Consider the contrast between Mars and Venus. potable water, the lifeblood of human and Terran life altogether, almost non-existent. The atmospheric conditions on one world is so thin that you can't breathe. There's no oxygen to be retained, and you have to deal. It's not quite a lunar surface, but you still can't operate without an environmental suit that will give you the protect you from the stellar rays that can get through the atmosphere and the unrelenting wind and sand particles, as well as provide you the oxygen you require. Any kind of serious settlement had to be built in domes or underground. And by enabling engineers and technology to introduce additional water, such as hauling in ice comets and such, and letting them bombard the planet's surface, also thickening the atmosphere, and to provide some other means. This is one way that they help terraform the planet somewhere you could operate on the surface without being in a biological suit, and could grow plants and have animals, etc. Venus was the opposite extreme, with temperatures upwards of 700 degrees, sweltering humidity, and an atmosphere that was just you weren't going to grow any human anything there. They did a lot of effort, including some great big solar shields, to help protect to reduce the solar radiation being hit on the surface to cool Venus down. And if I believe right, the Amaris Stefan had this genius idea to bring this giant space laser, basically this giant solar array, and tow it away from Venus to put it in a position to protect Earth, so they could turn this giant powerful solar projection ability in reverse, and focus it on an incoming fleet. In the process of moving it, destroyed the shield, which also eliminated the vital protection it provided for Venus, which in a very short few decades made Venus once again totally uninhabitable by human life. So many marginal worlds are made habitable by the use of these ice ships, as well as the technology. One of those early things that came on was this fellow that came up with this concept, and I should have wrote down the name of the guy, that would basically truck in ice. Ice pirates, anyone? Yeah, if you're familiar with that. So the idea being is that many more worlds that are marginally settled. The atmosphere is conducive, if not great. The environment's not utterly toxic. The problem is that the water sources on the planet are unsuitable for consumption. They're not potable. They're not usable by humanity or Terran-based life forms. So you can't bring your dog, your cat, and Rosie the cow and expect them to survive on the local water, which means that the world is all but inaccessible or inhospitable for long-term, large-scale development and population growth if you can't supply the water. So to do this, to get around this, basically they shipped it in, and it was the ability, the technology, more importantly, the FTL assets were available to do this and make it viable. And this still continues. It's something that doesn't get talked about very often in the Battletech universe, but it still continues. There are many worlds across the various houses, and a few scattered about the periphery, that are totally dependent on exports of food, water, fuel, even oxygen in some cases. They need to have the occasional replenishment shipments come in. And when that becomes impossible or unattainable, then that planet's going to die. It's just not going to be able to thrive, let alone survive. And that's typical. So to keep in mind that whenever we see, like in the Fourth Succession War, when House Davion and House Steiner stripped a big portion of their merchant fleet away from their merchant duties, and pressing them into the military service to help pursue the Fourth Succession War and to support and supply their troops. This put a horrible burden on the economic sector and the private sector of those two houses, specifically the Federated Sons, which is already an impoverished, really is large areas of the Federated Sons are impoverished. And so any kind of disruption to economics is bad, but one as vast as that could even be critical. So places that need important stuff are not getting them, or not getting nearly enough, and then their supplies are going to dwindle, and then people are going to suffer from it. And that's just one of those things that brings these worlds and makes these worlds habitable. World's otherwise, so, and other things to consider about water, the local water might be contaminated. There might be metals or minerals or chemicals or organics, bioorganics, i.e. viruses, microbes, etc., or unknown exotics in them. This is what makes them unsuitable for human consumption and or even basic human needs. I mean, if there's certain kinds of elements within the local water that prevent you from using it to wash your clothes or to take a bath in, to shower, then you surely can't consume it, and you don't want to risk that. And even, in some cases on Earth, we have contaminated water that's not suitable for consumption, and all the boiling in the world will not make that change. The place where I transport the sewer plant, where I transport the products that I pump out from my company, and we dispose of at the sewer plant, has signs everywhere that warn people. This spigot, that hose, is non-potable water. Most of our trucks have that printed on them somewhere on the tanks. My truck doesn't, but the majority of them do. It says non-potable. What that is a warning to people: don't tap it, don't muck with it, don't consume it, don't do nothing with it, because it's not going to end well. You're going to get terribly sick and potentially die from the stuff that's in it. We're bringing it to the sewer plant to be processed for a reason. There's a quite extensive process that they put all this stuff through to filter out and separate all the things that shouldn't be in the basic water. That way the water can then be returned to the water table, i.e. the nearby Des Moines River. So just so we look at some of the technology that exists and in limited degree still exists across the inner sphere in certain key locations that can be crucial to the operations of how a planet functions and works, is we have, like I said, the orbiting solar shields. These are designed to either to reduce the amount of heat that's on a planet. So if a planet's close enough to their sun, they're still within that quote humanity belt, or that life belt, that potentially means the planet could be terraformed. You need to reduce the radiation and or solar radiation that comes on the surface, and by doing that, you basically put up a big the very same technology that jump ships use to recharge their batteries. It is the same kind of thing you would use, and you can double tap that. I mean, if you create these big solar shields, then it would make perfectly good sense to also to turn them into basically giant solar collectors. This is why Stefan Amaris got the idea. He was going to move this thing because basically it's a giant freaking solar laser. If in his mind, it didn't function that way, and moving it was detrimental to its existence, but it didn't seem to bother the madman at that time. The other opposite side of this, of course, is solar collectors. So it's possible to have planets and moons that are far enough from the system's primary that they do not get sufficient solar radiation and light to make the surface warm enough to be conducive to terraforming purposes or for comfortable habitation. So by putting these solar collectors in orbit, these giant mirrors, and focusing that energy back onto the moon or planet in question, you can then help adjust the climate for the planet and make it more viable. Then there's the water filtration and purification plants. Some of the most basic stuff, and we see a lot of that. Once again, the sewer plant I was just talking about. These are vast facilities designed to use a number of different processes and various chemicals and filtration systems to filter out whatever it is that makes the local water, unpalatable or non-potable for human consumption. So it's possible that for many marginal worlds within the inner sphere still operating today, that they can, the reason they still are settled and still are viable is because they have the ability to filter the waters that they currently have and make it usable. I have been some places where the water is perfectly safe to drink, but it smells very bad, or it looks very bad. It looks nasty, yellowy, rusty looking color, or it smells like sulfur, or it smells like chemicals. But according to the chemist people who test it and the government who says, oh, this is perfectly good. You can think of a few of those in our country. So then there's the atmospheric scrubbers. The same scenario. The planetary atmosphere, our unique balance on Earth is not perfect, but it's in just the right kind of balance of material that allow us as humans and all of our animal friends to exist on our planet. So there's thousands and millions of planets out there that have atmospheres. Many of them have oxygen within the atmosphere, but perhaps they just don't have it in the level needed for us to make use of unaided. Or more likely, or just as likely, are that there are going to be other elements within that atmosphere, in that environment, that are toxic to us or interfere with our body's ability to function well. So if there are certain things that we can filter the air out for, so if we create giant filtration systems that allow the planet's atmosphere to be processed, and these particulates or chemicals or biologic, whatever, to be removed, and then perhaps, I don't know, used for some other process or stored somehow and disposed of, then you could once again functionally change the atmosphere to the point where we could breathe it without need of being in biosuits all the time. Even if you just had to have a minor rebreather or filter device that you would wear over your face, just being able to operate in a shirt sleeve environment is conducive to making planets viable. Isn't it interesting that so many worlds and so many science fiction franchises are human compatible, are human friendly? Worlds that potentially should have something in them that makes them, while looking ideally human suitable, or not. So then there's the humidity issue. There are certain planets or certain conditions, and we have that here on Earth. The humidity levels can get to be so oppressive, so nasty, so thick that you almost can't breathe it. It's the air is so dense that you have issues with it, or the moisture is so bad that, go down in some southern areas that are closer to the equator, and you'll find that things like fungus and mold grow a lot more faster and more frequent in places you don't expect it to, and they themselves have caused issues as well. So the ability to extract humidity from an atmosphere would also potentially allow for access of potable water, removing the water from the air and putting it in such a form that it be consumed. Just the opposite goes in that venue too. Quite a few worlds are too dry, too arid, and if you can introduce humidity to the atmosphere, you can once again potentially make it more viable and usable for humans and human friendly organic plants, animals, etc. Then it brings us to that final category that comes to mind, and that is like viruses, uh, little microbugs, things that exist on the planet that are fine for everything that evolved on the planet, but are toxic or deadly or uncomfortable for humans and human organics. So there are worlds in the inner sphere, once again, once in a blue moon, these sort of really hostile environment planets do get cropped up. Early on in the Grey Death Legion, they're stationed to a planet that's very, very rich in mineral resources, but the atmosphere is totally bollocks, and there's no terraforming that's going to fix it, or none of the terraforming equipment exists anymore, and everybody lives in domes. There's some 12 million people living in, or more people living in domes, because a supposedly rogue agent from Comstar basically tries to frame the Grey Death Legion by blowing up one of those domes and killing 12 million people in the process. Right? So, and there are other planets where it's in the book canons where an invasion is, or an attack on a world is stymied, or the defense of the world is stymied because maybe there's some kind of nasty bug that comes around every year, every so many years, that comes around. The flu season on that particular planet is extremely nasty, or anybody who doesn't live there and it doesn't have an immunity build up to something, so newcomers must have their shots. I imagine there's a lot of that goes on, and if you don't have the ability to get those inoculations against these things, that once again the world becomes very untenable for us. So that's when we're talking terraforming. With the mass destruction of the First Succession War, the Amaris coup and Kerensky's crusade to remove Stefan Amaris and his people from control of the Star League, or the self-claimed control of the Star League, saw a lot of these worlds suffer damage, and a lot of these terraforming systems suffered damage. And the technology levels, as we know, diminished with each succession, where it became harder and harder to field Star League era technology, let alone repair it and maintain it. If you can't repair it and you can't maintain it, you surely can't produce it. And the sheer amount of materials and exotics and so on and so forth, the more complicated something is, the more susceptible it is to a problem, because it's just easier to screw something up, or something can fall out of that construction chain, that manufacturing chain, that prevents you from getting the parts you need to maintain something. Like, I mean, look at this picture's obviously not from Battletech, but look at the giant atmosphere processors that we're seeing in the background. These things are just, they're extremely huge, extremely massive. Or if you've ever seen the Aliens franchise, the planet where they go to investigate the Aliens 2, where the Marines go in to a colony. Well, the colony was supporting atmospheric processors that were terraforming the planet's atmosphere to be more conducive to human life. And the facilities were freaking huge. Needed lots of stuff, lots of components, lots of material support. And I imagine that would be the same, would hold same and true to all the stuff in the inner sphere. So we look at what would cause some of the primary losses and of these worlds and these systems. First comes to mind is the heavily nuclear bombardment conducted by everybody. At some point, every house in the inner sphere and a few of the periphery nations during the First Succession War turned nuclear weapons against each other, whether it was against each other's naval fleets or against ground targets, in some cases against civilian targets. They did so, and they did so liberally. They really didn't show a lot of restraint, because they weren't concerned about the long term. They just figured they would beat their enemy, would take control, and they would rebuild everything. They didn't take into account that mutually assisted aided destruction concept, that what keeps this very fragile truce between the nuclear capable powers on Earth today from annihilating each other and basically putting our whole lives back into a Stone Age, where all of our problems and issues today would be extremely petty if we were all living in some kind of post-apocalyptic Mad Max survival mode, assuming we even were lucky to get to that point and not completely obliterated. But the fact was that hundreds of worlds became attacked by nuclear weapons, some a bit more extensive than others, of course, but it did happen. And then it came, of course, was along hand in hand with this was chemical or biological attacks. There were many chemical or biological attacks on various worlds. Militaries come in and they wanted to take control of the planet. They just didn't want to sacrifice all their troops doing so. Or when they went in and it just became untenable to take it with the forces that they did. And I've made this mention before in other videos. It's one of those things that the beliefs that we suspend to make Battletech function and be acceptable. Truth is, if you look at the world, and I say it today, look at the world today and the sheer number of armies, the sheer number of military assets around the world, good, bad, or indifferent, combined. There's 25, 30 million troops, soldiers, sailors, whatever, of all nations in service at any given day. And all the weapons of war, all the equipment needed to support all those weapons of war and all those troops and all their administrators and so on and so forth. It's quite staggering. The huge portion of the world's GDP goes into this military-industrial complex of protection and force projection, depending on the scenario and the will of those people in control. So when you have options to have all this stuff, and you don't have the option to send 50 divisions to a single world to take it, and you don't have the resources to defend a similar world with 50 divisions, you're going to send 5 or 1 or half a division or a regiment, and maybe the world's defended by a regiment of line troops and 3 or 4 regiments of local home guard militia units, and maybe a handful of scattered third-party interests or whatever, the local bodyguards and local crazy people, and just Farmer John back here who's retired from the service and got his old centurion sitting in the barn back there, if you buy into that stuff. So the fact is that if you find yourself you're attacking a world and you're grossly outnumbered by the defenders, you have to bring it or force equalizer to the table or go home. And they chose to bring the force equalizers to the table. And when nuclear weapons weren't conducive, we'll chemically bomb the crap out of people, biologically bomb the crap out of people. And in doing so, eradicated or severely damaged some specific planets' atmospheres that would take centuries, if not tens of centuries, to recover from that. I mean, that's just part and parcel of the worst that we can have from the interference. And then, of course, a lot of this was conducted during the First Succession War because of the sheer number of warships available. And for every warship, there's probably 500 starfighters, aerospace fighters. And most of these aerospace fighters, the heavy assault fighters, have the capability of carrying nuclear tactically nuke-equipped missiles. So even when the warships start to diminish, the assault dropships and assault fighters and heavy fighters still had the ability to deliver chemical, biological, and nuclear weapon ordnance on target, anywhere they needed to go. And this just pay the price when we have that. And then in addition to all that technology, all that lethal firepower, it's just kinetic bombardment. These vast warships had massive naval and autocannons and gauze rifles and laser batteries that could easily be turned on a planetary target, whether it was a regiment, regimental, forward operations base, or a regimental command center, or a regiment, and blast them to pits. And if that happened to be in the middle of a major city in the process, so collateral damage, my friends. That's where that term came from, collateral damage. And these things there's a reason why in the age of war, warships were so devastating on such a vast level that they trumped things like nuclear weapons. They were just as bad or worse than these weapons of mass destruction, because in and of themselves, they are capable of delivering multitude of weapons of mass destruction. And so it became, this is where we got the era of the Battletech raises up, and the warship era becomes a supporting role and begins to diminish even before the Star League completely dissolved. And the first Succession War sees the majority of the warships and the warship construction capabilities removed from the table. But that's just one of those things. But it also ties into another issue. Some worlds are going to perish and die from the lack of the FTL transport fleets. The same devastation that wreaks so many planets and so much industrial and technological capabilities of the various houses during the First Succession War was also rained upon the transportation system. The orbital facilities, the orbital repair facilities, the orbital manufacturing facilities for jump ships in general, commercial and military, it didn't matter. They were viable targets and were routinely destroyed or damaged beyond functionability. So when you entered the system, one of the first things you did was try to eliminate the possibility of the enemy ships jumping out of the system. And if you couldn't determine if an enemy or independent trader was who he was, adios muchachos. That's just the way they played it, and that's the way they went. So probably in that first 30 years, we know that 90%, 95% of the warship fleet disappears by the end of the First Succession War. Probably about 50%, 60% of the FTL transport system ceases to exist by the end of the First Succession War. And then another 20 to 40% of that, or maybe higher percentage, then is obliterated. The surviving FTL transport network is obliterated during the Second Succession War. It's not until the end of the Succession War that people start looking at each other sideways and go, maybe we need to stop targeting jump ships, because we can't produce these things anymore in any significant numbers. We're going to find ourselves not having to worry about an invasion because we're not going to leave the planet, and vice versa. We're going to literally cut our own throats to save, to try to in spite of ourselves. So the lack of FTL transports limits access to these worlds, access to vital resources. What happens to these planets that are totally dependent on food coming from a neighboring system? What happens to these planets depending on water from a third-party access? What happens to these planets that have some kind of virus or biological issue that is easily kept under control with a yearly or lifetime inoculation, and then suddenly you don't have the materials to manufacture these things locally, or we don't have the technology, because that was another thing that's kind of foolhardy, and we've seen it. We've suffered in part firsthand the same mindset of the 90s and early 2000s when companies started to downsize their inventories and what we call just-in-time delivery. ISO 2000, that's a legitimate thing. Google it, look it up, Wikipedia that, my friend. It's a legitimate thing. One of the reasons we have such a problem with our logistics systems today, in part, is because our corporations encourage themselves and each other to manufacture today, sell it tomorrow, ship it the next day, get the material needed to manufacture the replacement tomorrow, and not keep anything in any significant supplies on hand. Now, there's a reason why it used to be a massive warehouse outside of a factory complex, because they would keep a month or 2 months worth of materials on hand, because you never, in part, you never knew what was going to cause a delay in shipping of something. But now shipping delays are constant. One part of my real life scenario, place where my truck, where at the very sewer plant that I go and dump my truck at, they pipe off the methane to a nearby power plant. And to do this, they have a specially custom built pump. It's a one-of-a-kind pump specific for this particular place and its need, because they have what they call an explosion chamber. Within this gas chamber sits this pump that allows it to force the gas down the pipes to the power plant. Well, when the pump failed, they didn't have a backup for it. They didn't have a replacement for it. They had to pump out the gas out of the chamber, remove the pump, take the pump to the shop, and then start to repair the damage. And then what happens? They don't have all the necessary parts to do that. So they order those parts because that's how they've been doing things for the past 20 years. Unfortunately, some of those parts apparently are coming from very far away, and it could be a couple of weeks, because they told us that they would have this fixed by the 6th. And the 6th came and went, and the problem wasn't fixed. And then they said, oh, we'll have it fixed by the 13th. And my bet is the 13th, Monday, will come and go, and this thing will still not be fixed. Because this happened last year 3 times. And now what this does, so I understand full hand just how messed up this can screw things, is that this pump now, where our capacity down there was already kind of at the high end. So you get a whole bunch of trucks in there like myself trying to unload, and the system can't handle the capacity of the stuff that's the byproducts of what's being processed. This slows down in how long or how much you can pump and how soon. And so there have been wait delays as much as 6 hours. You get there and 6 hours later, you're finally allowed to unload. And that kills you for the day. You can only do so many jobs in a day. You just can't. And if you can't get to that job in a timely manner, you're only going to do the one job because you spent the rest of the day trying to unload your truck. And in addition to that, on a normal good day, so use that as a comparison, I can do my job. From the time I punch in at the gate to the time I scale out and leave the gate, 15 minutes. If nobody's there in the way, 15 minutes. So from 15 minutes to 6 hour wait. So if you see how the lack of transportation, the lack of parts, the lack of planning, all this stuff takes us roll up. It's plays a role in how things get messed up and screwed up. So this just leads these worlds to become abandoned or deserted or destroyed. So we talk about the lack of FTL transport, the diminishing transportation capabilities from both drop ships and jump ships. This leads to things like economic collapses or economic secession altogether, and the inability to supply even the basic necessities: food, water, medicine, vaccines, oxygen, etc. Then there's the rare natural disaster, meteor strikes, supernova, pulsars, etc., which in the Battletech universe is fairly rare. This is not something that normally crops up too often. So the fact that worlds are abandoned if the economic system is failed, and you can't get the materials you need, and you can't export the materials that you produce, well then it's a non-viable thing. You have to shrink. You have to change how things look at. This is what happens to, in a large scale, to the periphery. The periphery at one time, prior to, during the Star League, and just to the very ass end of the first Succession War, this periphery was much bigger, much more developed than it currently is as of 3025 into 3050, 3150, whatever our current particular timeline in the game system is. And what we're talking about here is, for example, the great outback, or the great outer wasteland. So once upon a time, prior to this, the Star League's war on the periphery states, the Outwards Alliance, for example, was actually twice the size it is now. It composed many more worlds and systems than it had. And then between the war and then the following war and the collapse of the Star League, and then the exodus of the SLDF fleet and the various succession wars, probably better than half of the planets and worlds, the outer section, the outward spinward sections of the Alliance, the Outwards Alliance, become isolated, untenable, unsupportable, and cut off. For the lion's share, they died off. The people moved away if they could. They just simply disappeared if they couldn't. And that became affectionately called the Alliance Waste, or the Outworlds Wastes. So there's lots of worlds out there with the remains of human civilization on them, but they're abandoned or left to die. This occurs all over the inner sphere during and after the first Succession War, but toward the end of the Star League, the Amaris Civil War, things are already on the outs for a lot of these places, a lot of these planets, and the first Succession War source book, which is what I really enjoy having this book, because it's answered some questions that I've always made some assumptions, some leap of faith, and a few kernels that are speckled about the various novels and stories and source books and lore. It's just they just crop up and occur occasionally. So I'm going to touch on a couple of those things, and then I'll be wrapping this thing up for you. So we're going to talk about Comstar's STAP program. All right, so 106. Talk about, let's see, Lost Worlds. Succession Wars ultimately wiped approximately 800 worlds from the maps of the inner sphere and the local periphery states. Although the first war only directly claimed just under 150 of these planetary casualties, the damage done during that conflict contributed to the eventual demise of many more as technology continued to decline and jumpship fleets continued to shrink. Popular accounts often blame the loss of these worlds on rampant use of mass destruction weapons such as atomic, nuclear bombs, chemical weapons, and engineered biological agents. More often, however, it was isolation that made these worlds vanish, either in death from starvation, plague, or environmental collapse, or slippily abandoned by travelers who found nothing worth the expense of visiting the worlds to begin with. In truth, even with modern technology, it takes a great deal of damage to, quote, kill a world and such that mankind cannot survive there. Examples abound of systems throughout the inner sphere which only human settlements or few environmentally enclosed arcologies, either buried underground, submerged between toxic waves, or domed against toxic atmospheres, or in hospitable weather. Some systems, such as Kurlum and Gulf Breeze, have virtually no planetary habitation at all, but are instead the home of spaceborne colonies or orbital habitats. In these systems and others, where populations are minimal for one reason or another, killing the world simply means destroying the majority of the human settlements and or life support systems that keep them viable. For other more populous worlds with stable ecosystems, destroying a world entails a greater spread of strategic weaponry focused on large population centers and industries and vital water sources. Yet, even in these cases, there will always be survivors capable of scratching out a living amid the ruins and wastelands. Ultimately, it is only a supreme act of God that can truly render a solar system completely uninhabitable by mankind. These are the most extreme cases: an exploding star, a stray gamma burst, a planet-cracking asteroid strike. But in the grand scheme of the interstellar community, what takes an inhabited star system to fall off the map has less to do with how the world has been killed and more to do with what's left worth saving. This factor, apparently subjective to so many actually grounded in cold hard objective data, is what truly decides whether or not a star system remains on the simplified charts used by interstellar merchants and military strategists alike. Depopulation. Primary deterrent in what removes the world from the list of mankind's interstellar homelands is naturally population. This tends to be a flexible value with no absolute minimum, although the conventional standard is around 10,000 living inhabitants, about the size of a single medium-sized suburban settlement. Systems in which the planetary population of primary wood or human enclave drop below this number are often considered depopulated, but it may still appear on charts for some other reason, such as presence of a recharge station or that allows jumpship traffic to pass through on their way to other worlds. On other extreme worlds, could be classified as depopulated on charts, even when they possess hundreds of thousands of people in residence, just because the last few visitors could not locate any of these inhabitants in the wake of a disaster or other misfortune. Dead versus abandoned. A depopulated event can be caused by anything from a natural disaster, starvation, or disease to damage from war and or collapse of the local government. Cases where the local inhabitants are lucky enough to have access to sufficient jump ship and dropship assets, a system no longer viable for human habitation could be depopulated by a mass migration or evacuation. But as transport vessels grew increasingly scarce during the succession wars, such abandoned worlds were the exception rather than the norm. By 2824, of the 148 worlds that dropped off the maps, only 34 of them were abandoned. The rating systems were declared dead by the only census takers entrusted at that time, Comstar's Safe Transit and Astrogation Project, i.e. SAP, or STAP. The Reaper's Scorecard. Comstar began documenting the decline of the Innersphere practically from its inception. As part of Jerome Blake's effort to rebuild the HPD network for the Innersphere, he created the Safe Transit Astrogation Project, an agency that would establish whether a populated system in the Innersphere merited a hyperpulse service based on its population and viability. Starting in 2790, these planetary census reports were performed once every 5 years. Where worlds were identified as having been depopulated, the STAP would record its data, pass it along to their cartography decision as a complementary service for jump ship captains everywhere. This is what happens when you allow one source to control certain things and have nobody else to verify or to back up on that. So if Comstar decides your world is not something that they would prefer for it to die, they can just gradually remove your references from the astrogation charts that they graciously give away to anybody and everybody, house and independents alike. And then within a generation or two, nobody knows your system even has got a settled planet or it's even worth visiting, and nobody comes. And you're left alone. The service interface to the local digital network connected to the HPG grid generally worked automatically with the jump ship's onboard navigation systems as part of routine software updates available to all commercial traffic. Military shipping also accessed these map updates on their own violation, standard procedure since the Starleague days, when the maps required continual updates thanks to the establishment of new colonies and ports of call. In this manner, the entire map of the Innersphere was updated within a matter of weeks for interstellar travelers everywhere. In addition, Comstar dispatched technical ships to depopulated systems to deploy warning buoys in case where the local world had suffered depopulation results from some form of biohazard. You know, we'll even make sure you double down on making sure nobody comes to your world. We will put up a couple of satellites in orbit to warn people when they do come in to stay away from the planet because there's some kind of toxic or biological nightmare on that surface that'd be better off left alone. And there might actually be nothing wrong with the world. Why would Comstar do things like that? Why? Right? For worlds found to have been depopulated or which were in the process of depopulating, the STAP program has created a shorthand list usable by common laymen. This list would record the depopulated world's position, its common name, and the date of its depopulation, as well as the date upon which it was delisted from the star maps. The dominant cause of depopulation simplified down to famine, disease, war, or other disaster. Over the course of the succession war, space travelers of all stripes would come to refer this layman's list as the Reaper Score Part. So let's take a look at just this list. Between the start of the first succession war in 2786 and its stuttering conclusion in 2822, a total of 146 star systems vanished from the maps, removed by Comstar's Safe Transit and Astrogation project. This courtesy service rose naturally far below. Compelling Confederation, 21 worlds are depopulated, 15 are dead, 6 are abandoned. 6 are caused by famine, 9 by famine, 8 by disease, 2 by war, 2 by other disaster. And the Draconians combine 22 planets. 15 are dead, 7 abandoned. Causes are famine 9, disease 3, war 7, other disasters 3. Confederate Suns 29 worlds. 24 dead, 5 abandoned. Famine 12, disease 8, war 7, other disaster 2. You know, cutting off their economic lifeblood would consider as a other disaster. Right? Free Worlds League has 3 dead, 0 abandoned, famine 1, disease 0, war 2. Learn Commonwealth sees 7 depopulated, 4 are dead, 3 are abandoned, 3 are from famine, 2 from disease, 2 from war. Outworlds Alliance, 30 worlds are depopulated, 19 are dead, 11 are abandoned, 14 from famine. So think about that for a minute. 14 planets just in the Outworlds Alliance dies from famine. There could have been tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people on that planet, and the food stops coming. The means to leave the system stops coming. The water stops coming. The vital parts needed to keep the atmospheric plants running so the air would be breathable stops coming. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions, perhaps even billions with a B perish. And nobody cares, or nobody notices. How many billions more dead were there actually in the various succession wars that what made the quote official counts because of technicalities. The Rim Worlds Republic, 33 worlds are depopulated. 24 dead, 9 abandoned. 23 from famine, 5 from disease, 2 from war, 3 from other disasters. Then Quarian Cordat loses 3, 1 dead, 2 abandoned. 1 from famine, 1 from disease, 1 from another disaster. The Magistry of Canopus is the only world that doesn't see any losses. No worlds lost, no famine, no disease. Right? Just what it's saying, what it's saying. So here, the scars of total war. Although 2 centuries have passed since the last major attack using nuclear chemical weapons occurred, we still live with the effects of those outrages today. A number of birth defects attributed to genetic damage sustained by the infant's long-dead ancestors have only recently begun to drop off. This in no way means the figure is small. We estimate about 1 million per year. Secondary effects are chemical and nuclear attacks on the land have also begun to drop off slightly. Constant influx of untainted plants and animals that dilute the effects of these tainted life forms, but at considerable cost. There are still large tracts of land unsuitable for use, not to mention the occasional nasty surprise, such as a radioactive dump site or an unexploded biological weapon found buried beneath the soil. Target sites, usually cities, are called dead zones if created by a nuclear weapon, poison pits if created by chemical weapons, and rat nests if created by biological weapons. Wearing a light environmental suit, the humans can usually remain safely in these places for about 3 hours. Any longer, the visitor risks contamination. Right? So, that leads me to one other thing. Gotta love the Comstar. Now, I'm not totally displeased that Comstar is no longer in play. That between after the breakup of World Break and then World Break's shenanigans of the Jihad, Comstar basically bellies up and ceases to exist. It served a purpose, but it was terribly corrupt and quite driven by its own particular beliefs and dreams and schemes. Helpless Comstar's STAP service was for jumper captains. We know today that the Order's motives were not altogether altruistic. Through the STAP, whole swaths of the periphery were simply dropped off the map, reported as depopulated, usually due to famine or disease. While it's likely true that such crises were claiming their due among the locals, Blake's distaste for the periphery, especially the denizens of the Rimworld's Republic, is well known today. Having STAP exaggerate the state of decline on those worlds helped to justify passing them over for HPG service, while incidentally hastening their demise by causing shipping services to simply note their deaths and prematurely stop coming by. How many periphery folk died, one must wonder, solely because of petty contact with delusions of godhood blamed them for the bringing down the Star League. And then, of course, there were the secret worlds, the ones Comstar hid quietly by quietly fudging their data sets, sometimes going so far as changing the names a few years or so in advance to really confuse things. Among those we would one day learn were the dreaded 5 worlds. Since the Jihad, many money-grubbing merc, lost tech scavenger, amateur sleuth, and would-be adventuring explorer have gone searching for the 3 or 2, depending on whose story you're buying, remaining worlds, only to come out empty-handed or dead or both. Of course, the funny thing is, Comstar took a lot of planets off the map for perfectly legit reasons along the way, so even searching the dead list leaves open the question as to which of these are the hidden planets and which are merely lost, for the conspiracy for all seasons. So, isn't that peachy? That makes me wonder, of all the abandoned planets in the world. In the earliest days of Battletech, when we was playing our tabletop war game and stuff, and then Backward came on, I started wondering, there was always this talk of just how nasty and devastating the First Succession War and just how truly brutal things had got, and how much destruction and so on and so forth. Just how many worlds did end up being destroyed outright or abandoned. That also implied that there were many of these worlds still in existence, and although they were supposedly completely destroyed, perhaps they weren't completely destroyed as much as it was pertained to be. And by leaving it out of the equation, this brings us back to what's the viable possibility that these worlds would be usable for other nefarious purposes. How many rat holes or places are there for the dispossessed of the inner sphere, the would-be bandit clans, the bandits, the pirates, the lone wolves, the survivalists, many of these pirate captains and these colorful captains who have access to some really old data, astrogation charts wise that predate the rise of Comstar, wouldn't look at those maps at some time, at some point, and wonder what might still be there, something that's worth salvaging perhaps, something that's worth investigating, maybe if nothing else, it's a convenient place to go and lay low, because who would bother to go look for you there? Who's going to, who of the inner sphere powers are going to bother to think of that place, because that place no longer exists. It was obliterated during the first section or the second Succession War, or so on and so forth. And so these ghost worlds exist, and their numbers, the sheer numbers, are staggering. If you think of this from a different angle, the average inner sphere house as of 3025 and up into the current timeline, much of that, it's changed radically with the inclusion of the clans. They've carved up the inner sphere pretty bad, I'll grant you. So as of 3025, the average inner sphere house runs around 400 settled worlds. Now, what defines this world? Just who decides what constitutes a settled world? Well, Comstar did for the lion's share, Comstar is one, and most of the reason they decide those worlds are considered settled is because they have some kind of transmitter there. And so you have the Class A, Class B, and Class C transmitters, which is why I made comments in a lot of the videos I did about, well, the Free Worlds League has nearly, the Federated Suns has nearly 500 worlds. They probably have twice that many number of worlds. They just have around 500 officially settled worlds with a population, if we look at what's listed under the STAP program, of 10,000, a population of 10,000 and or more, or a Class C HPG. So how many worlds, when settled worlds, are there that were just marginal for one reason or another, that just so far out of the way, off the beaten track, or the resources are so mundane that they're just easier to obtain and much closer to the factories and stuff than coming here, or for whatever reasons, political or chicanery, that they're just considered so backwater that maybe only a few thousand people live on them, or maybe 20 million people live on them, but they actually do not have access to the HPG network, and depend on the occasional tramp freighter coming through or house ship that's within the, they sit within the great house that claims the space, but even the great house ignores them and writes them off because they don't care, or they don't realize just how much of a population is still on that planet, or how big it's grown, because once again, the place just isn't made its, either hasn't made its waves, or it hasn't been in a position where it's been in any need for anything. So I believe that for every settled world the House officially has listed, there's probably 2 additional worlds that are within the House boundaries that have populations on them that are just too small to be considered viable settled worlds, or insignificant, or purposely left out. And that means the house worlds and house resources are much vaster. And if you look at the sheer space of a given, the parsec space of a given house, there's huge numbers of solar systems and star systems that don't have planets, or have planets that are nothing but airless rocky planetoids, or flaming balls of magma that are not really even approachable for utilization. And how many systems are just, chock-a-block of asteroids and debris belts and things like this. There's loads of resources there, but there's so many systems that have that stuff that there's no reason to go in and tap and exploit all of them. And eventually, someday, there might be a point or reason or need, and we'll move into that system to do something or exploit something or whatever. But because they didn't have what was considered a marginally inhabitable world, or the world that was just so far out of the way, or so difficult to get to, or so minor in the grand scheme of things, it just never went anywhere. I expect that there's a lot of those. And when you look at your house play, it's just like, oh, we work for this major house and that major house. House Serrano's source book comes right back to mind. I believe there are thousands of tiny minor houses spread out throughout the inner sphere and the periphery, that everyday challenges and everyday struggles are facts of life for them. But in the grand scheme of the great houses and the great lords, they are insignificant specks, or not worth a bother unless they make themselves so. So there could be many worlds, many places to tap and play and to incorporate into your game universe, and the windows for possibility in a great sandbox that is the Battletech universe is vast. This is Rick. I hope you guys have a great weekend.